It begins with the sharp echo of a gavel slamming against wood, not once, but twice, as if to demand order in a chamber that feels anything but orderly. The bright lights bear down on the long mahogany desk, illuminating stacks of papers left, untouched, as if the truth itself has been smothered beneath political theater. Cameras are already rolling. Millions, though not yet watching live, will soon see every micro-expression, every smirk, every slip. The tension is thicker than the silence before a storm. On one side sits Jim Jordan, a man whose reputation precedes him like a drumbeat of confrontation. His shoulders hunch forward, his voice already sharp with that familiar tone, a mix of accusation and arrogance, the posture of someone convinced the louder they shout, the more right they must be. Across from him sits Jasmine Crockett, eyes steady, posture calm but coiled with conviction. She doesn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Where Jordan thrives on chaos, Crockett thrives on clarity. And then it happens. A question hurled with obvious malice, coated in self-righteous scorn. Jordan, pounding his words into the microphone, practically sneers. Some people here don't seem to know their place, don't seem to understand the rules that hold this country together. His words hang in the air, bitter and unmistakable. A phrase loaded not with substance, but with the insinuation of dominance, as if truth itself were his to define, as if dignity could be trampled under sheer volume. Across the committee room, staffers steal glances from one another. The cameras zoom in, searching for the reaction shot, for the spark that could light the fire. Crockett's eyes narrow ever so slightly, the kind of look that says, "Not only did I hear you, I will not let this pass." The first murmurs ripple through the crowd behind them, muffled gasps hidden by coughs, suppressed chuckles waiting to burst into open reaction. Because everyone knows what's coming. This isn't the simmer, this is the boil. The insult isn't going to fade into the stale congressional record. It will be picked up, turned over, and answered with precision. And what happens next will leave the entire hearing room, and soon the entire nation, stunned. Because Jasmine Crockett isn't about to play defense. She is about to redefine the very game. To understand the electricity building in that room, you have to look beyond the polished wood furniture and the ritual of the gentleman yields and point of order. This wasn't just another congressional skirmish. No, this was the collision of two Americas staring each other down. One clinging tightly to power through bluster and intimidation, the other standing tall through dignity, persistence, and the voice of communities. Too often dismissed. Jim Jordan's presence at the center of so many hearings is no accident. His role has long been that of the relentless agitator, the attack dog who interrupts, steamrolls, and attempts to drown out opponents with sheer volume. To his supporters, it's theater. To his critics, it's bullying with a gavel. And here, in a hearing that was supposed to examine accountability, his priority was clear. Not fact-finding, not fair process, but spectacle. Enter Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman, but anything but timid. She comes from a background where resilience isn't a strategy, it's survival. Her very identity, as an attorney, as a black woman, as the descendant of those who pushed through closed doors and forged spaces for themselves, radiates, stakes larger than any single back and forth. In Jordan's sneering insinuation that she didn't know her place, generations of coded disrespect echoed. This was not just an insult. It was an attempt to diminish an entire spectrum of voices that he could not control. And that's why the room bristled. Everyone could feel it. This was about more than one exchange at a microphone. It was about how America defines place, who gets to speak, who gets to challenge, who gets to belong. The divide on display wasn't just partisanship. It was the age-old tug-of-war between exclusion and inclusion, arrogance and dignity. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion because the stakes had leapt beyond the chamber. On social media, clips of these hearings often go viral not just because of the words spoken, but because audiences far outside Washington recognize themselves in the struggle. For millions of Americans who've been told to stay quiet, be grateful, or stop complaining. Moments like these are more than entertainment. They become personal vindication. When Jim Jordan lashes out, viewers hear echoes of the boss who dismissed their ideas, the teacher who doubted their abilities, the politician who decided their family's dream wasn't worth defending. Jasmine Crockett, in that exact moment, was not simply answering for herself. She was bearing the weight of those who've been underestimated and erased, pulling their struggles into the bright, unflinching television lights. With each pause, each stare, each syllable she prepared to deliver, the balance in the room seemed to tilt. And yet, as palpable as that energy was, no one had seen the full force of what was about to unfold. It wasn't going to be a sharp retort quickly forgotten. It was to become one of those mic drop moments replayed endlessly, reshaped by memes and hashtags, reverberating across dinner tables and timelines alike. Because the truth is, these confrontations decide more than who wins in a 30-second clip. They shape narratives about who holds credibility, who seizes courage, who claims the mantle of leadership in an era where sincerity itself feels in short supply. At that hearing, the stakes weren't measured in procedural outcomes. They were measured in whether dignity could withstand hostility, whether composure could silence chaos, whether the America of empathy and inclusion could hold its ground against the America of contempt. And when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, prepared to answer Jordan's sneer not with bitterness but with brilliance, that was the moment everything shifted. What came next didn't just alter the tone of the hearing. It left the entire country breathless, talking and watching. Because in Washington, very rarely does someone turn the tables this completely. But that is exactly what was about to happen. To understand the eruption in that hearing room, you have to place Jim Jordan beneath the magnifying glass of his own history, because his behavior that day wasn't a glitch, it was the very blueprint of his political persona. Jordan has long thrived on confrontation, elevating himself by sheer volume, as if raising his voice substitutes for raising the quality of his arguments. His backstory is a study in contradictions. A man who wears the armor of toughness but often reveals fragility the moment he's challenged with clarity. His career, from state politics to Congress, reads like a chronicle of perpetual combat. Rarely remembered for legislation that shifted the lives of everyday Americans, Jordan built a brand as an antagonist. Cable news clips became his lifeblood. The congressional hearing became his stage. The microphone, his weapon. He was the lawmaker, less interested in writing laws than in dominating the spectacle of lawmaking. Every raised brow, every pounding fist, every interruption performed a central message. Power is not gained through nuance but through intimidation, and yet, beneath that bluster lies irony. Jordan brands himself as a truth-teller, yet time and again finds himself dodging scrutiny when the questions swivel toward him or his allies. He presents himself as the defender of order, but often sows disorder by design. His monologues are filled with references to rules, propriety, and accountability, except when those same ideals would apply to him. Then the rules become elastic, blurred under the glare of partisan loyalty. Take the way he positions himself, the man of the people, unafraid to buck the establishment. But Jordan has never truly operated as an outsider. He built his career climbing steadily within the structures of power, carving a path by attaching himself firmly to dominant partisan machinery. His image of scrappiness disguises the reality. He is a creature of the very system he claims to relentlessly challenge. It's less about tearing down corruption than about deciding who gets to wield corruption. In hearing after hearing, his tactics follow the same pattern: interrupt, overwhelm, insist, repeat. He doesn't yield so much as dare others to wrestle. His words back from him. To some, it's a show of strength. But look closer, and what reveals itself is fear. Fear that silence would expose the paucity of substance behind the thunder. Like a coach shouting wildly from the sidelines, Jordan's intensity misleads the crowd into believing victory is close, when in truth it's distraction from a lack of playbook. This contradiction, arrogant display masking hollow core, is why his opponents see through him more quickly than his supporters admit. For those on the receiving end of his bombast, there is no revelation, no piercing rhetorical dagger, just noise and posture. But to millions watching through filtered clips, his strategy has worked. Television optics over truth. And in Washington, optics can be currency. That is precisely why the confrontation with Jasmine Crockett reverberates differently. Jordan's entire persona depends on throwing opponents off balance, knocking them off script, drowning them in. His pace. It rarely works when his targets refuse to flinch. Against him, fragility shows up as anger. When someone pushes back with facts, with coolness, with poise, it unsettles the theater. His act requires his opponent to stumble. If they don't, the spectacle transforms. Suddenly, it is not him towering over them, but them illuminating his smallness. It is also worth remembering the cultural layers embedded in his sneer. When Jordan tells someone they don't know their place, it's not just parliamentary shade. It's the echo of centuries of exclusion and marginalization. He didn't invent the phrase, but his use of it carries the arrogance of a system where people in power have long dictated who gets to speak and who must stay silent. His arrogance is amplified by what he embodies, a figure determined to guard gates that were built to keep people like Jasmine Crockett and her constituents outside. And yet, every gatekeeper eventually faces a reckoning. Jordan's style can electrify his base, but it also places him in precarious territory. Because when arrogance fails, when your interruptions no longer intimidate, when your sneers no longer silence, you are left exposed. Stripped of the theater, the substance that remains must speak for itself, and in his case, that substance is thin. That is why journalists, staffers, and even other lawmakers roll their eyes in those hearings. They know what's coming the moment he launches his speech, a performance more intent on going viral than on clarifying truth. They know the contradiction, the self-styled crusader of truth bending truth at will, the advocate of order thriving on disorder. It's a dance that can only hold as long as those around him let the performance go unchallenged. But Jasmine Crockett was not about to let it slide. She represented not just a personal rebuttal, but a generational one, an ancestral rebuttal, an ideological rebuttal. In the theater Jordan thought he owned, she was about to rewrite the script. And that's the irony of arrogance. It often scripts its own downfall. The louder the bluster, the bigger the silence when it finally collapses. The hearing's tension was no coincidence. It was inevitability catching up with contradiction. Audiences didn't just sense Jordan might stumble. They knew it. They felt it. They waited for it with bated breath. The man who built a career on noise was about to face the quiet precision of something stronger than bluster, unapologetic truth. And when that truth landed, it didn't just puncture the moment. It turned his entire act back on him. Because arrogance can shout, but it cannot endure. And soon, viewers would witness that collapse in real time. To truly grasp the power of what Jasmine Crockett unleashed in that crowded hearing, you have to step away from the cameras, away from the mahogany desks, and back into the story of how she even reached that seat in Congress. Because Crockett didn't arrive there through inherited privilege or the casual glide of connections. She clawed her way forward, fueled by a mix of grit, intellect, and a refusal to accept a world where dignity was negotiable. Born and raised in St. Louis, Jasmine Crockett's journey began not in the marble corridors of power, but in neighborhoods, where people felt the sting of being unseen. Her childhood was shaped by watching her community wrestle with inequities. In housing, in education, in opportunity. She grew up absorbing the lessons you can't teach from a textbook. What resilience looks like in families juggling multiple jobs, what hope looks like when people keep faith in systems that so often fail them. It was here she discovered that justice wasn't an abstract concept. It was survival. Her parents, like so many striving Americans, knew sacrifice intimately. Theirs was not the glossy narrative of easy ascent. It was the kind of sacrifice that meant late nights making ends meet, encouraging their daughter to work hard not just because the world was fair, but because they knew it wasn't. Jasmine understood early that doors rarely swung open. They had to be pushed through, often with force. That relentless push carried her to college, then to law school. Law, for Crockett, was never simply about the prestige of a degree. It was a weapon, a tool capable of defending those whom society preferred to ignore. She became a public defender, throwing herself directly into battles most would rather avoid. Day in and day out, she represented those who could not afford lawyers of their own. The poor, the voiceless, the written off. In those cramped courtrooms, Crockett sharpened her mettle. She faced prosecutors armed with resources and police, reports stacked against her clients. The imbalance was always staggering, one side with power, the other with barely a chance. Yet Jasmine stood in that gap, delivering counter-arguments not with bitterness but with unwavering clarity. Every case was a reminder. Justice wasn't guaranteed. It had to be wrestled from the grip of systems designed to withhold it. This was her proving ground. She began to understand that the courtroom mirrored America itself, those at the margins fighting not only for freedom but for validation, for proof that their stories mattered. She became known for her fierce advocacy, her blunt honesty, and her refusal to bow to intimidation. Opponents might outspend her, outnumber her, or attempt to outshout her, but they couldn't outmatch her fire. When she ran for office, it wasn't the glamorous jump of someone chasing fame. It was the logical next step for someone tired of treating symptoms instead of causes. In the legislature and later Congress, she stepped into chamber after chamber with the same mindset she carried into court. This fight isn't about me. It's about those who can't sit here themselves, about the voices suffocated under policies designed without them in mind. Her identity only made this path more significant. As a black woman stepping into predominantly male, predominantly white political landscapes, Crockett carried not only her own weight but the weight of countless others who'd been told the political table wasn't built for them. Every hearing, every speech, every comment lobbed her way came layered with subtext. Subtext she recognized instantly. It wasn't just debate, it was the timeless refrain that people who look like her, who come from where she came from, should stay in the background. But Crockett never accepted the background. She leaned into authenticity, refusing to soften her passion or hide her sharp edge to appease the comfort of others. Her boldness wasn't style, it was substance, honed from years when shrinking would have been easier, but silence intolerable. That authenticity became her armor inside the halls of power. When others entered hearings with a script, she entered with conviction. When others practiced performative outrage, her determination was rooted in a lived reality, in communities where policy isn't theory but survival. This contrast is why viewers connected with her. She is not the polished careerist rehearsing talking points, but the defender who fought for people before cameras ever shined on her face. And that's why, in the confrontation with Jim Jordan, she was uniquely equipped. He came with bluster, she came with backbone. His weapon was interruption, hers was preparation. His stage was noise, hers was truth. While Jordan had spent years thriving on rattling opponents, Crockett had spent years standing her ground in spaces designed to rattle her. Nothing about his sneer or his arrogance could surprise her. She had seen it before in judges who doubted, her in opponents who dismissed her, in institutions that underestimated her. And time after time, her answer was the same. Outthink them, outlast them, outshine them. Her very presence in that chamber was proof of resilience, a rebuttal before she ever opened her mouth. She symbolized the immigrant dream fulfilled through descendant sacrifice, the civil rights battles carried forward, the unapologetic pride of identity that refused to shrink for anyone's comfort. That day, those watching didn't just see a congresswoman. They saw a child of sacrifice grown into a champion of justice. They saw someone molded not in wealth, but in trial. They saw a lawmaker who had already endured louder voices, tougher odds, and higher stakes than anything Jordan could throw at her. So when her eyes narrowed and she leaned forward to deliver the line that would flip the room on its head, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a lifetime's worth of resilience distilled into a moment, and that is why she was fated not just to respond, but to prevail. The chamber didn't know it yet, but Jasmine Crockett's answer was about to silence arrogance with the one thing it could never defeat. Lived truth sharpened into unshakable power. The gavel had barely stopped trembling when the words began to fly faster, sharper, heavier than before. What had started as a loaded jab suddenly swelled into something far larger, a duel of pace, power, and will. The hearing room, usually dulled by the monotony of procedure, now felt like an arena, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that was about to spiral beyond the ordinary. Jim Jordan leaned in again, his voice climbing toward its familiar peak, a harsh staccato more reminiscent of a coach berating a team than a legislator seeking truth. His repetition was not subtle. Hammering accusations, circling half-thoughts, pounding phrases meant less to be answered than to overwhelm. "You don't follow the rules," he barked, his tone bristling with the presumption that his interpretation alone defined order. His voice cracked slightly under the strain of his own volume, but he pressed harder, convinced the weight of his shouting could drown everything else. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She did not attempt to match his thunder. Her calm was its own counterweight. She scribbled a note, lifted her eyes with deliberate slowness, and then rested her chin just enough to make one thing clear. She was listening, and she was not impressed. That composure rattled Jordan more than any insult could have. His strength lay in destabilizing opponents, in forcing them into defensive posture. Crockett refused to step back. She stayed anchored, letting him expend his energy like a storm, raging against an unmovable wall. The contrast was almost cinematic. One man flailing in controlled chaos, one woman embodying serenity under fire. Spectators noticed. Staffers shifted in their seats. Reporters tightened their grips on pens as if the next quote might be the one to dominate headlines. A murmur buzzed at the back of the room when Jordan, struggling to pull the spotlight back to himself, began to edge from irritation into outright insult. He veered from policy into insinuation, pressing lines intended to belittle. His words dripped with condescension, the undertone unmistakable. "You don't belong here. You don't measure up. You should stay in your place." But the more he jabbed, the clearer his desperation became. His gestures sharpened, his sentences clipped. When Crockett finally looked up fully and locked her gaze with him, the room seemed to pause for half a second. Her eyes said what her lips hadn't spoken yet. "Is this all you've got?" Jordan, realizing he was losing grip, tried again, to overrun her responses. He cut her off, raised his volume another notch, throwing interruptions like jabs in a boxing match. The irony, of course, was that the more he tried to control the stage, the less control he had. His voice shook not with authority, but with panic, masquerading as power. Crockett, however, chose her timing. She injected only short, firm phrases at first, deliberately measured. Each word carried weight because she hadn't wasted them in the noise. And every time she spoke, the room leaned forward, because amidst the storm of Jordan's interruptions, her calm rebuttals landed like anchors. The exchange escalated like a duel, but not a duel of equals. His escalation was frantic. Hers was strategic. His insults scattered wildly like sparks into kindling, hers pierced, calmly mocking his attempts without breaking composure. And soon the visible gap between them couldn't be ignored. Jordan's collar dampened with sweat, his gesticulation growing erratic, his papers shuffled in frantic hands. Crockett, on the other hand, became only more composed. A quiet smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Not arrogance, but recognition. Recognition that his unraveling was no longer hypothetical. It was happening, right there, live, in front of America's cameras. Journalists would later compare the scene to a stage where one actor had forgotten his lines and attempted to scream over the mistake, while the other, perfectly rehearsed, delivered her cues so confidently that the spotlight naturally shifted away. But for those in the hearing room, it didn't feel like acting. It felt like justice slowly, steadily, exposing the emptiness of intimidation. By the time the back and forth teetered on its peak, there was electricity in the air. Everyone could sense that Jordan's tirade had burned almost to exhaustion. And in the silence following his latest interruption, short, sharp, full of frustration, the moment had ripened. Jasmine Crockett, calm, immovable, was about to pivot. What followed would not be a continuation of escalation. It would be the moment escalation met its inevitable ceiling, the exact point where arrogance met its counterforce. Because Crockett was done absorbing. She was ready to deliver, and what happened in that single exchange, her eyes lifting, her voice steady, her words slicing like glass through the noise, was more than just a rebuttal. It was the closing of one act and the stunning opening of the one no one would forget. The chamber braced itself without knowing why, sensing the shift. The storm was ending, and the lightning strike was about to begin. The silence stretched, thick, electric, crackling like the moment before a thunderclap. Jim Jordan, flushed and sweat-lined, clutched his stack of papers as if sheer force of motion could rescue him. His voice had just finished its last jagged crescendo, but what followed wasn't applause or submission. It was quiet, heavy, aching, quiet. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately. She leaned forward. No rush, no flinch, no panic, letting those watching take in the contrast. The storm on one side, the calm eye of truth on the other. Her hand rested, softly on the mic. She didn't snatch it. She claimed it, with composure that radiated certainty. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her tone velvet-wrapped steel, not raised but resonant enough to cut through every inch of that chamber. For someone so determined to lecture the rest of us about rules, you sure forget them when they apply to you. The room reacted instantly. Heads tilted upward, eyes widened. The back rows buzzed with whispers barely suppressed. Because here it was, the response they had been bracing for without. Realizing it, she didn't rush. Crockett gave space between her sentences like a skilled musician letting the rests pull tension tighter. You throw accusations, yet when we ask for facts, there are none. You pound the table, yet when it comes to substance, it is empty. She paused just long enough for the air to sharpen. You ask who belongs here. Her eyes never left his. Let me be very clear. I belong. Jordan's lips parted, the instinct to interrupt twitching across his face. But Crockett had already taken full command. Her voice layered over his attempted murmur like a tidal wave swallowing a pebble. What I don't belong to, she continued, noting the rhythm in her tone, is your small vision of what leadership looks like. Because leadership isn't finger-pointing. It isn't yelling the loudest. Leadership is defending those who don't have the luxury of this microphone. Gasps dotted the chamber. Staffers traded quick side glances, fully aware this was no ordinary rebuttal. This was blow-for-blow demolition. Crockett was no longer answering Jordan. She was exposing him. And then she began to drop proof, methodically, surgically. You tell us about accountability, yet when your own allies were called to account, where were you, Mr. Jordan? Not demanding transparency, Not demanding truth, but protecting, shielding, excusing. Accountability isn't a shield you pick up only when it's convenient. It's a responsibility. Jordan shifted in his chair. He tugged at the edge of his jacket. He opened his mouth to interject, only to be cut down not by volume, but by Crockett's. Peace. She raised a hand ever so slightly, not to silence him, but to signify unmistakably, "I have the floor now." "You claim order," she said, her voice rising in tempo just enough to quicken heartbeats. "But order does not look like pounding your fist when others try to speak. Order does not look like disrespecting colleagues because you have no defense left. Order looks like discussion. It looks like proof. It looks like fairness, none of which your tirades deliver." The chamber simpered with restrained energy, like a crowd at the edge of cheering but bound by the formality of oak benches and parliamentary rules. You could feel it, though. The murmurs snapping through text messages, the nods from faces trying, and failing, to stay neutral. Crockett leaned back for a single beat, letting Jordan stew in the silence her words demanded. Then she leaned in with the final strike of Act 1. "So if you're going to tell someone to know their place, sir, then maybe, just maybe, you ought to remember your own." There it was. The gasp reverberated like a collective inhale. Camera crews leaned into their lenses, pens scratched furiously across pads. Jordan blinked hard. For the first time all morning, his lips closed around words that wouldn't come. Crockett didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her tone stayed steady, professional, devastating in restraint. She knew dignity wasn't only moral, it was tactical. To stand calm in the face of volatility was to magnify the unsteadiness of your opponent. But she wasn't finished. She wanted to elevate the moment out of the petty and into the profound. "This chamber," she said, sweeping her gaze across the room, "wasn't built for shouting matches. It was meant as a place where every American's voice, no matter how small, could echo in these halls through their representatives. Yet, too often what we hear isn't their voices. It's ego. It's noise. It's the weaponizing of privilege to drown out everything else. That's not democracy. It's theater." The metaphor seared. People listening could feel a shudder of recognition. This wasn't merely about Jordan's tirade. It was about a deeper sickness in the system itself. And Crockett was performing the antidote in real time. "Here's the truth, Mr. Jordan," she said, softening her voice into something sharper than a sword. "The people I represent have endured far louder voices, far deeper insults, and far longer attempts to silence them than anything you can bring. And yet, here I stand. Because we belong here. Because the America we believe in isn't afraid of my voice. It welcomes it. It needs it. And no gavel, no glare, no burst of anger will erase that." The room froze. You could almost hear the hum of the cameras transmitting her words beyond those walls, to households where immigrant families sat with their children. To communities where being dismissed as lesser was a daily ache. To ears longing for vindication, for affirmation, for proof that their dignity mattered just as much as anyone else's. Jordan slouched back, a rare crack showing through his armor. His jaw shifted, uncertain, caught between another futile interruption, and the realization that there was no air left to steal. The bluster had dissolved into silence, a silence now owned entirely by the woman across from him, and Crockett, still collected, delivered her closing blows like stepping stones toward the next act. "What America saw just now was a choice," she explained, voice strong but not harsh. "The choice between arrogance and accountability, between theater and truth, between yelling at people and fighting for people." Another pause, just long enough to let the weight settle. "I know which side I stand on, and I hope America watching knows, too." The thunderclap moment landed. A pause, heavy and cinematic. even inside the hearing, the chamber where clapping is forbidden. Audible. Murmurs rippled like a current, breaking the thin surface tension of decorum. Outside those walls, though, audiences were already reacting in real time across social media feeds, hashtagging, memifying, clipping, sharing. The counterattack wasn't merely delivered, it had detonated. And Jordan's expression told the story clearest of all. For a man accustomed to being the intimidator, the dominator, the unrelenting interrogator, he now appeared smaller. Not because Crockett out-yelled him, but because she had chosen not to yell at all. She had worked with a scalpel when he waved a hammer, and in that clash, the scalpel carved deeper. The entire chamber buzzed, not from words yet to be said, but from what had just been witnessed. Arrogance silenced, dignity ascendant. But, as powerful as that takedown was, this was only half the story. Because in today's America, a blow like that doesn't stay confined to 4 congressional walls. It escapes instantly into the bloodstream of the nation, where amplification can turn moments into movements and a single takedown into cultural memory. What came next would prove this point beyond doubt. Because Crockett's mic drop wasn't the ending. It was the ignition of an aftermath so explosive, the entire digital landscape erupted, and that eruption would shake not just the hearing, but the national conversation itself. The words hadn't even finished echoing in that austere chamber before the wildfire began. On Capitol Hill, hearings are typically consumed with tedium, legal fine print, hours of monotone testimony, but not this time. This time, phones in. The audience lifted like synchronized choreography. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm demolition shot out into cyberspace before the final words had even landed. And within minutes, the ripple was undeniable. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, every platform exploded. Hashtags bloomed instantly, some triumphant, others cheeky. Crockett, checkmate, rose first, ricocheting across trending boards with lightning speed. Then followed Know Your Place, flipped and reclaimed by audiences that understood exactly what Crockett had just flipped on its head. By the hour's end, memes plastered Jordan's baffled expression beside Crockett's unshakable gaze, spawning viral captions, "Smile like Jasmine when arrogance collapses." The digital applause was instantaneous and relentless. Short clips of her takedown looped endlessly. Her lines cut into TikTok-friendly snippets, remixed over dramatic music, GIFs capturing Jordan's slack jaw paired with Crockett's perfectly timed pause. Even teenagers who never watched a hearing before were suddenly duetting the clips, reenacting her lines as if she'd just dropped an Avengers-style catchphrase. But it wasn't just ordinary users. Commentators pounced. Progressive analysts on YouTube broke into emergency live streams, replaying the exchange frame by frame as if analyzing a historic boxing match. Cable anchors called it the most memorable committee takedown in years. Columnists described it as the moment dignity stared down derision and won. Even celebrities piled on. An A-list actor retweeted the clip with the caption, "This is the kind of energy we need in every room." A Grammy-winning singer shared it on Instagram, adding, "Black women been saving democracy. Y'all just keep catching up." Activists heralded it as a teachable moment, turning Crockett's words into rallying cries at rallies and community events. By nightfall, the moment transcended commentary. It became cultural shorthand. People began referencing her mic drop whenever someone calmly outsmarted arrogance in daily life. A high school student shutting down a bully might jokingly be tagged, "giving them the Crockett treatment." Twitter threads spun her words into motivational posters, digital art, even merchandise. Etsy filled with mugs bearing her closing lines. T-shirts appeared within hours emblazoned with "Dignity Bluster." And Jordan? He couldn't outrun the avalanche. Clips of his red face sputtering began circulating side by side with the buzzword flailing. His raised voice spliced over circus music. His papers shuffling looped in GIFs labeled "Defense," .exe has failed. Conservative allies tried pushing back, claiming it was just a disagreement, but the visual contrast was undeniable. The calm versus the chaos, dignity versus disorder. For once, the narrative slipped fully out of his hands. But perhaps the most profound response was among ordinary viewers, immigrant families, working parents, students of color who saw in Crockett not just a sharp retort but a reflection of their lived struggle. Social media brimmed with posts like, "I felt that in my soul. How many times have we had to sit quiet while being talked over? Thank you, Rep. Crockett, for showing the world we belong here." Another shared, "Watching her face him down without losing her cool gave me more hope than anything I've seen in politics this year." This was more than viral entertainment. It was validation, an emotional exhale for millions who'd been waiting to see arrogance confronted with composure, bullying countered with brilliance. The digital chorus wasn't just clapping, it was reclaiming power. Even late-night comedians joined the wave. Monologues ridiculed Jordan's meltdown, sprinkling Crockett's quotes like exquisite punchlines. Audience laughter filled studios, laughter that doubled as catharsis for a public weary of division and noise. And with that ridicule came resonance. The clip reached beyond political echo chambers, seeping into cultural conversation. In sports arenas, fans lifted homemade signs, with Crockett's words scrawled across the cardboard. At Sunday services, pastors folded the moment into sermons about grace, truth, and holding fast under pressure. By week's end, the ripple hardened into narrative. Storylines weren't drafted by politicians but by the people. Jordan was not the conqueror of the stage. He became its punchline. And Crockett. She became the symbol, the story, the archetype. Proof you can carry centuries of struggle into the chambers of power and not be diminished. Proof that the spectacle of arrogance always crumbles when measured against the quiet force of dignity. News coverage reflected it plainly. "Crockett redefines the room," read one headline. "From hearing to hurricane, how a freshman rep shifted the narrative," declared another. The phrase "mic drop moment" appeared so often it became shorthand, cementing the scene in political lore, and perhaps the most threatening part of all for her opponent. It wasn't merely Crockett's victory. It was communal. Ordinary Americans didn't just cheer from the sidelines. They claimed her triumph as their own. Her words echoed in their homes, in their memes, in their everyday conversations. Jordan walked out of that chamber diminished, but Crockett left as a symbol magnified by millions. What had begun as a tense exchange was now a cultural earthquake. And yet, even amidst the digital firestorm, something deeper pulsed beneath the cheers and hashtags. A question, a reflection, a moral call rising from the spectacle and waiting for clarity. Because moments like this cannot just end with noise, they demand meaning, and Jasmine Crockett, as she always had, was ready to deliver it. What followed next would shift the viral, into the universal, the moral resolution that tethered this clash of wills to America's oldest question: what kind of nation do we choose to be? When the buzz of social media reached its deafening pitch and the laughter on late-night shows turned Jordan's outburst into comedy, Jasmine Crockett chose something different. She didn't bask in the applause or revel in the takedown. Instead, she stepped into what leaders are called to do once the dust of battle clears: transform spectacle into substance and pain into principle. In interviews following the hearing, her tone was not vindictive. She didn't dance on his rhetorical grave. She reframed the insult instead, raising it above the cheap theater where it was meant to land and delivering it back to the people as a universal message. "When someone tells you to know your place," she said calmly, "remember that your place is wherever justice needs you to stand. Your place is at the table, your place is in the fight, your place is wherever truth must be spoken out loud." That sentiment resonated beyond politics. It touched immigrants who had been told to stay silent, women who had been talked over in boardrooms, children who were told their names were too different to belong. It became a redefinition of place itself, not as something assigned by gatekeepers but claimed by those who refused to be erased. Crockett reminded her audience that place is not permission, place is purpose. And woven through her words was an even deeper truth: service is louder than arrogance. Jordan had roared, but she had served, serving her community, her clients in court, her constituents in Congress. Dignity had faced down derision and carried the day because dignity lasts where noise fades. "We're not here to perform," she said at one speech to supporters. "We're here to protect. We're here to provide. We're here to prove that the measure of leadership isn't how forcefully you silence another voice, but how fiercely you fight so every voice can be heard." It was the kind of statement that pulled the lesson out of one chaotic hearing and stamped it into the arc of American identity. Arrogance may trend for a day, but integrity becomes memory. This moment, Crockett argued, wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every dreamer who had been told they weren't American enough to belong. It belonged to first-generation children translating documents for their parents. It belonged to students who had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. It belonged to ordinary people standing in line at voting booths with conviction, in their hearts, proving that democracy is carried by the patient, not the privileged. The crescendo of her reflection built on this foundation of belonging. "Our fight isn't about who can shout louder," she said in a later town hall. "It's about who can serve longer. It's not about who gets the last word. It's about who writes the next chapter." Her message didn't erase the sting of Jordan's insult. Instead, it dissolved it, absorbed it, transformed it. The attempt to minimize her became the megaphone through which she elevated truth. Every insult became raw material for resilience. Every jeer became fuel for a broader purpose. And that is why the story mattered. Because struggling with dignity, answering hostility with principle, isn't just politics. It's the essence of America's best self. Crockett reminded audiences that this country has always moved forward because people refuse to accept their place. From civil rights marchers to immigrant pioneers to suffragists demanding equality, progress was born not from silence, but from steady, unflinching defiance of exclusion. As the applause grew, online, in communities, in quiet conversations at kitchen tables, the morale crystallized. America must decide over and over again whether it rewards arrogance or uplifts dignity, whether we build systems where volume dictates value or systems where service defines leadership. In Crockett's moment, dignity had prevailed, and for everyone watching, it was an invitation to claim space, an invitation to find courage in civility, an invitation to demand more than the loudest voice in the room. The hearing ended, but the resonance lingered, because Crockett's words carried something larger than a takedown. They left an echo rising like a hymn, that our place is wherever justice calls us, and our voices belong in every room where power sits. And that echo, firm, inspiring, undeniable, promised that arrogance will always fade, bluster will always stumble, but dignity will endure. And so, the story that began with Jim Jordan's fury and Jasmine Crockett's calm conviction found its immortal headline: Jim Jordan loses it when Jasmine Crockett outsmarts him in heated hearing. What the title promised, reality delivered. But it ended with something far more valuable than a viral spectacle. It ended with a reminder that arrogance, no matter how loud, cannot outlast dignity. That service, not shouting, is the true measure of leadership. That when someone tries to tell you where your place is, the only honest answer is this: our place is here. Our place is everywhere. Justice requires us to stand. Jasmine Crockett showed the nation what it means to embody composure under fire, to turn insult into affirmation, to transform a sneer into a spark of empowerment for millions. Her mic drop didn't just silence one man in one hearing, it uplifted communities across the country who have been told to stay quiet for far too long. And now comes your part. Because stories like this aren't meant only to be watched, they're meant to be carried, shared, turned into momentum. If you felt the power of Crockett's response, if you recognized your own journey in her defiance, then help amplify it. Share this video so others can feel that same rush of validation. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time dignity rises and history is made right in front of us. Be part of this movement that insists respect is stronger than hate, truth is louder than chaos, and dignity will always win. Because in the end, every one of us has a place in this story, and that place is not in silence. It's in standing tall, together, in the light of justice.